and wetlands and eutrophication a little bit, and then we'll go back to our case studies. These methods are not as clearly defined for streams and wetland, or well developed as they are for lakes, partially because the relationships are not as clear between nutrients and algal biomass or productivity. But because of legislation in the United States, there's actually eutrophication and nutrient criteria coming up for streams, rivers, and wetlands, as well as estuaries and lakes. In general, the principles are the same. You control the nutrient sources and you're better off. And the general idea is that the biotic integrity tends, all things being equal, if you stay towards the natural nutrient concentrations, you tend to preserve biotic integrity. This might be endangered plants and animals in wetlands. This might be the ecosystem functions in streams. And I gave an example of that when in the last chapter when I talked about stoichiometry. If you increase the phosphorus concentration in the streams, the invertebrate diversity went down, right? So that's talking about maintaining biotic integrity through that, and we just talked about that in stoichiometry. So this is a similar graph, and it happens to be total nitrogen on the x-axis and benthic chlorophyll in streams. And you can see that there's a significant relationship there, although it's a lot noisier than the relationship is in lakes. It's not nearly as clean. And that's because streams have other things like floods that take away algae. Maybe some of them have canopy cover with leaves that make them limited by light. But we also see if there's a lot of phosphorus around, you have more yield of chlorophyll than if there's less phosphorus around. That is, these dark points tend to be higher than the light points on average, and there's a statistically significant relationship there. So again, needing to control both nitrogen and phosphorus is probably the best idea. So there's actually a long history of control of eutrophication in streams based more on the idea of biochemical oxygen demand and putting just too much carbon into the system, and sewage treatment then being put into place. And so this is the situation that you'd have if you put a lot of untreated sewage into a river or a stream, which was happening in the United States up until the 60s, happens in many parts of the world up into this day. And you see that you have high biochemical oxygen demand with that carbon loading on the top panel. You have a big dip in oxygen and going anoxic immediately below that sewage outflow. You have a lot of ammonium that comes off out of the plant because the sewage comes out anoxic and everything is pushing in the cycle, remember, nitrogen cycle toward ammonium. As it gets oxidized, it gets converted to nitrate, and that 3- should be right up there. It gets converted to nitrite. So if there's oxygen and ammonium, what's the process that converts it to nitrate? I know I'm asking you to remember back past the last test.
What was the question?
If there's ammonium and oxygen, and the ammonium gets converted to nitrate, what is the process called?
Remineralization.
Nope. Wait, somebody
That's
said it,
not-
huh?
Denitrification.
No.
That is nitrification.
Other way, huh?
It's nitrification.
Nitrification, right?
It's
Good.
with oxygen.
Okay, you close. Almost got it. Mineralization makes ammonium from organic material, remember? Okay, then you get typical organismal responses from upstream to downstream. You get a lot of pathogenic bacteria coming in because it's not treated sewage. You get what's called sewage fungus, which is actually big, heavy bacterial growth that can handle anoxic. And then you move downstream, and you get things like Cladophora that are sort of eutrophic loving algae. And eventually you get back, as you get further and further downstream, the stream self-purifies itself. And then you have things like tube effects, the worms that can stand very low oxygen, moving into midges, which are pollution-tolerant species, Acellus, which is somewhat less pollution-tolerant, but still is more, still sewage-tolerant, and Acellus is an isopod. And then clean water fauna bioindicators. So then you can use biological indicator species like EPT, which we talked about, Ephemeroptera plecoptera, Pherecoptera, and you'd expect that to increase as you went down from here. Okay, so modern sewage treatment plants essentially take all this stuff that happens in the river and compress it into the actual sewage treatment plant itself in a series of ponds and treatments. And unfortunately, our field trip, we're not gonna be able to get to that. They're still under construction. They've been doing it for 4 years. The next class is gonna be able to get there, but you guys are, well, I think we'll just try to drive up by it and we'll walk up on the levee and I'll just show you kinda how they do it, but. So if you treat your organic carbon, your BOD comes in a lot lower, you can maintain higher oxygen. If you treat your nutrients, you don't get so much nutrient coming out, and they control ammonium because they're required to by law. So they push it over to nitrate in a pond that basically makes that nitrification happen in the pond when they aerate it. And then you push all of these things, squeeze all of these things up closer to where the outfall is, and your clean water fauna comes back much quicker. So this is another sort of form of eutrophication and sewage treatment right out in the river and the stream. We've talked about some of the sort of general sense of eutrophication. I'll go through a series of examples that illustrate some of the points we've talked about. Examples listed here, the first being Lake Washington. Lake Washington is a lake that sits just to the east of Seattle inside of the Puget Sound. And historically, Seattle and the cities around there dumped their sewage into this lake. It's a fairly large and oligotrophic lake. And this basically led the lake to become more and more eutrophic. And one of the scientists that was working at the University of Washington, Tommy Edmondson, started to recognize, he was working on zooplankton, but he started to recognize that the zooplankton and the phytoplankton species in that lake were becoming more and more like those found in eutrophic lakes. And then the algal concentration was coming up, cyanobacterial blooms were increasing, and he started pushing them to clean up the lake, and it was a tremendous fight. So he's the one that noticed the shift initially to algal species. And this led to this fight over whether phosphorus was causing the problem and whether sewage was causing this problem or some other things. There's some interesting book that he wrote on this about the political battles that fell out from this. But the bottom line is that he wasn't politically active, he just continued to make the scientific points that the nutrient had increased, that the algal populations were going up, and that if they continued to eutrophy the lake, they would push it to the point where the hypolimnium would go anoxic and the phosphorus would start coming back up again. So they'd never be able to get the lake back. Eventually, the public was convinced, and the municipalities, instead of putting their sewage there, just put the pipe over the Puget Sound and send it off down into the sound instead. And then this diverted the sewage away by the 1960s, and the lake came back as was predicted. So this is one of the big triumphs of limnology in understanding trophic state of lake and how to control nutrient pollution. We have here year on the x-axis, and the top graph has the total phosphorus, and you can see how in the late 60s that total phosphorus coming in the lake dropped off substantially. And then we have the surface chlorophyll, and you can see that prior to 69 or 68, that algal blooms, these high spikes, were common in the lake. Were starting to become more and more common even. And that the percent of cyanobacteria in the lake was quite high, up to 100% during the summer when it was warmer months. But that it slowly fell off, and then there appears to be sort of a drastic drop where that's almost not there at all anymore. So there's definitely a recovery in this particular lake. And only recently, between cleaning up the lake, putting in fish locks at the Ballard locks between Puget Sound and Lake Union, which drains out of Lake Washington into the ocean, and cleaning up the small streams coming into this and restoring them coming into the lake. They've actually restored salmon runs, and they now have actual salmon fishing season in the lake. So it's been a remarkable example of recovery of a lake from pollution, and a testament to what limnologists can do with their science of practical benefit to humanity. Another example is Lake Truman in Sweden. This is a lake that was sitting on the edge of a city. It was only a meter deep, had lousy water quality. The fish couldn't survive in there very well. People couldn't swim in it. And they were literally thinking about filling the lake in. Because they were putting sewage into this lake, but they calculated if they took the sewage out of the system and put it into other places, it would literally take hundreds of years for the nutrients in the sediments to stop coming back up. Because it is eutrophic and that is anoxic, the iron and the phosphate weren't trapping the sediment on the oxidized microzone at the surface. It was continuously reloading the phosphorus. So they thought about just basically filling the lake and forgetting about it. But eventually they put the money in to actually dredge a half meter of sediment off the top of this lake. So they basically went back prior to the time when the watershed was developed, and detergent containing phosphates were being dumped into the lake, and the phosphorus took all that phosphorus out that was in that sediment, took it out and spread it on fields outside of the watershed because it was nutrient rich enough it was actually sort of a fertilizer of sorts. And the lake now has recovered to the point where people can swim in it, where there's not fish kills, there's a fishery in it. And it's a fairly small lake. It's not a Lake Washington is maybe 30 miles long. This is maybe half mile across or something like that, a kilometer or something like that. And so removing sediment like this is quite expensive. But in this case, because it was right near a city and they had the tax dollars, they decided to do it, and they were successful in it. So this is the bad case, and when you push a lake too far, you have to take extreme measures to get it back to its state, the desirable state.
Did they remove the sediment?
Pardon?
How did they remove the sediment?
They just had a barge that sucked the stuff up off the bottom and put it in, then they had to dry the water off of it before they could spread it out. But yeah, just a big old mud sucker, basically. Lake Tahoe is an example of an ultra oligotrophic lake that sits on the border between California and Nevada. And this is home of a number of ski areas and on both sides of the lake, and then casinos on the Nevada side of the lake. This lake has a water retention time of 700 years. So once nutrient gets in the system, it's going to take a long time. It gets mixed in the system, it's going to take a long time to get out. And when we talk about ultra oligotrophic lakes, we're talking about secchi depths of many meters, 40 meters historically. I mean, this is a secchi depth that's deep enough, like the little secchi disc that we have. You lose sight of it because it just becomes too small, right? That's what 120 feet or something like that. It's very difficult to see it. So they use bigger, more the oceanographic ones, and so they can see them, not because it's too small, but because you actually lose the light to see it. So historically, it was 40. It's about half as blue as it was, half as clear as it was. And initially, septic systems were polluting the lake. So again, this phosphorus system, phosphorus was coming into the system, and it was a nitrogen-limited system. That all the bioassays suggested that it was nitrogen-limited, but it was stimulating productivity. So they took the sewage and just essentially pumped it out of the basin. The reason it's an oligotrophic lake is it has a very small watershed. It's almost completely circular, so it has a very low shoreline development index. It's one of the deepest lakes in North America, right? So it just has a little bit of little bit of watershed coming into this lake. So they just could easily, well, it costs money to pump the sewage out, but they pump it out into a river that drains away from the lake. So this basically switched the lake back to a phosphorus limitation from a nitrogen limitation. And it's unclear how far this lake's gonna go because of a number of political problems. One is having agreements between California and Nevada to control nutrients. And they have to control nutrients by doing things like stopping watershed disturbance, stopping further development within the basin. And there's a lot of economic pressure to make more casinos and make more ski areas and put in more vacation homes. And so there's a lot of pressure to put more and more people around the edge of this particular lake. But it's not clear how well that's going to go. It's still an uncertain future. And this, you also have to ask yourself the question: is a lake that's intrinsically this clear, is that an important thing for people to have, right? I mean, is that worth foregoing another casino or something like that? And then they come up against weird issues like there's the ski areas that have downhill racing, and they ice the slopes by putting nitrate on it, and it basically causes more ice to form on the track, and that things like that put nutrient in are kind of hard to stop. The more people you have around, the more activity. They just kind of, even though they're illegal, they kind of build up on themselves. So this is there's a picture in the book of Charles Goldman, and he's a limnologist at UC Davis who spent his career trying to protect this lake and doing long-term surveys of the lake. And there's a picture of Clinton and President Clinton and Vice President Gore out on a boat looking at the Secchi disk. And the title in the Sacramento Bee said something about them lowering a dinner plate over the side of the boat, which I think got translated from a Secchi disk is kind of like a dinner plate. So then they just said, well, they lowered a dinner plate over the boat. So I don't know, it's kind of a funny story. The next one we'll talk about, we talked a little bit about this already when we talked about wetlands and hydrology and getting the hydrology back, but the Everglades and Okeechobee. And this continues to be a problem of nutrient pollution. And that's because there's been a massive increase in the amount of agriculture over the years. And starting quite some time ago, they started draining the marshes around Lake Okeechobee, and then between Okeechobee and the Everglades, where the water flows in a sheet down the bottom of Florida and then out into the ocean. And they drained these areas and planted sugarcane and other crops in there and put a lot of fertilizer on them. And these systems are highly phosphorus limited. And they add that to taking water and decreasing the natural flushing, and part of the canal system was put in the first place to sort of drain Miami and keep water away from Miami when they got a lot of water. But it means that it doesn't move through the Everglades and flush the nutrients out. And so one of the things they're doing is they have these wetland treatment areas where they actually create restore a wetland and use that wetland to take phosphorus out of the water. So they dump the phosphorus-rich water into it, and as it works its way through, the phosphorus deposits in the wetland and decreases, and then the outflow can go back into the Everglades. So they're sort of sacrificing these areas to trap the phosphorus to protect the areas downstream. There's South Florida Water Management District is essentially set up based on tax dollars, and there have been large federal lawsuits over this. And they are also dealing with things like invasive species and a lot of other things. But they are at least now getting to the point where it's recognized as a problem, and they are starting to control phosphorus. It's still unclear whether they're going to be able to protect the Everglades in the long run. So in general, this brings up the idea of as wetlands as nutrient sinks. And because people have started to use wetlands as a way to treat sewage, you've got this situation in the United States now where nutrient criteria are starting to be required. And so municipalities, when they put sewage out, can't just dump the sewage into a lake or a river, whereas historically, except for in areas like Lake Washington or where there's been specific legislation to control that, there hasn't been a blanket-wide approach to keep rivers, streams, wetlands, and lakes lower nutrient. And so one of the things that people will do as a tertiary treatment to sewage, and we'll get more into sewage, I'll talk more about sewage treatment right before we go on. When's that?
Next week?
Okay, next week. I'll probably talk about sewage treatment later on in this week then. Is that you can use wetlands as nutrient sinks. And they tend to be better at nitrogen than phosphorus removal. Because if you remember, the nitrogen cycle has denitrification, where nitrate is converted to nitrogen gas, and that can just go into the atmosphere. But phosphorus has no gaseous phase in the cycle. And so it can be taken up by the plants, it can be precipitated, but at some point the system saturates up with phosphorus and will take no more out. Unless you remove vegetation and take it somewhere else, or you scoop up the sediments and take them somewhere else and then rejuvenate that process. So a lot of times in these systems that are just made for removing phosphorus, they'll have to continuously harvest plants and then maybe put them on, make compost out of them and put them on cropland or gardens. This is a useful thing for some municipalities that have put in these treatment wetlands, because they bring in a lot of wildlife. They become areas that people can use to recreate in anyway, or around the edges of anyway. And the realization that wetlands actually have intrinsic value is making this a more attractive approach for municipalities to take when they treat their sewage. There's a number of places around the country that have done that. But this also brings up the point that if you already have a wetland there, you may not want to use it for that particular purpose, because it causes big shifts in the species and the functions in those wetlands. So we talked, for example, about carnivorous plants. We talked about the pitcher plants and the sundews and the Venus flytraps and those kinds of plants. Well, they remember why they caught insects. What did they get out of catching the insects? Phosphorus or nitrogen, right? Because they can photosynthesize, so they're not going to be limited by carbon. But they're in these very nutrient-poor wetlands, and they get their nutrient from that. If you start polluting a wetland like that, then you get these shifts in community structure, and those poor nutrient species don't do so well. So this also goes back to the example that I gave you of where they were trying to restore the wetland, and they took the river water and they stripped out the phosphorus, but they had high sulfate in it. And then that actually led to more phosphorus, because the sulfate ended up being converted to sulfide, binding with the iron, and the phosphate came out of the sediments. And the sulfide was poisoning the macrophyte roots. The ultimate thing there was to try to get that wetland back to an oligotrophic state and get the native species that were in it as well. So there's examples of wetlands being eutrophied throughout the world. But if you understand them, if you can construct them, you can use them to your benefit as well. So there's a trade-off there. Clark Fork River is a large river that drains out of Montana into the Columbia River Basin. And they had large algal blooms in that river. In addition to that, the upper areas of the river were subject to mine waste runoff. And so there'd be these rain events that knock out some of the tailing ponds, and massive fish kills downstream because the heavy metal is coming into the system. So it's a really kind of an abused river. But they started cleaning up the metals, and then the other thing was to try to clean up the nutrients. And we went into the Clark Fork River as consultants and told them what we thought they needed to do. And then they started try to get at these goals with voluntary nutrient reductions. What happened though was that they pretty much held their nutrient concentrations constant over the last 20 years. So they haven't had much improvement in many areas upstream of Missoula, but it hasn't gotten much worse. And the reason for that is that the large municipalities were able to take the nutrient out of their inputs for the most part, but the number of vacation homes and houses in the river, near the river, came way up. And they all put septic systems in, and septic systems take out pathogens, but they eventually the nutrients break through and get through the groundwater and into the rivers and streams. And so we think that that's why there hasn't been huge improvement there. But the Missoula Sewage Treatment Plant 1 and Stone Container, which is not there anymore but is a paper plant, we're both putting in large amounts of nutrients. And they both controlled their nutrients substantially under this voluntary program. And so downstream from Missoula, the situation improved noticeably. So there is some way to control nutrients. The reason this is of interest is because one of the first river systems where they've gone through and tried to control eutrophication. Many lakes have had this eutrophication control. The Lake Washington stuff started in the 60s. Now the rivers and streams are starting to talk about what effects nutrients might have on those, how they may alter their biotic integrity. And this is a case study, and it is difficult to control it in the face of particularly large amounts of development, which we saw in the Lake Tahoe example as well.